Okay, and we're back, still talking about the Great Leap Forward and this ideological campaign to eradicate the pest of snail fever from Chinese society. For decades thereafter, the Maoist model for healthcare was hailed internationally, east and west, as a success. It was considered affordable, cooperative, and creative, and the disease to this day is thought to have completely disappeared from China at during this period, even though there's over 1 million people that are inflicted with the disease today. True, the program was a success, as were many others in public health during the Maoist era. But how and why it succeeded is actually something that's shrouded in myth that was designed to protect the head of the party. Rather than embrace the campaigns, locals and cadres actually resisted participating in these efforts to go out and kill snails or even to follow basic guidelines for public hygiene set by the state. Instead, recent scholarship by historian Miriam Gross shows it was actually experts sent down to the countryside who were denigrated as rightists that would create many of the solutions that saved millions of lives inside China in the 20th century. It was only by accident, not the triumph of the commoner's wisdom over technical education and expertise, that would have the Communist Party succeed in this endeavor. The Great Leap Forward then caused complete chaos throughout the countryside and within the economy, in part because the second leg referenced in Mao's slogan of walking on two legs was an effort to decentralize the economy, to allow for the leadership of local cadres so as to create a mass line. Economic management was taken out of the hands of central ministries and economists, suffering from the stain of the 100 flowers themselves, and instead given over to locals who created their own targets, their own methods, and their own ideas about how to leap ahead. They also produced false data and misreporting that eventually led the Statistical Bureau in 1958 to announce that the Great Leap Forward had produced a doubling of food and cotton production, that then led the party's Central Committee to propose incredible targets that couldn't possibly be met in 1959. These numbers would eventually hold the country hostage. Grain requisitions based on the expected surplus from these increases drained the countryside. And eventually, famine and malnutrition would claim the lives of 20 to 30 million people from 1958 to 1960. Critics from within the party who had the courage to speak out, such as Peng Dehuai, tried to halt the program in 1959 at a summit in Lushan, but they were attacked and purged as rightists cast out of the party. Worse, zealots and rural managers actually would put the benchmarks of the Great Leap Forward in 1959 and 1960, meeting their quotas, above the survival of their own communities, not realizing until 1960 that the economy and the rural masses had basically been ruined. These errors were exacerbated by the early 1960s because of the Sino-Soviet split. Tension between the two great communist powers turned into open hostility and a rivalry for international leadership. There were rumblings in 1957 when Mao visited the Soviet Union for its celebration of its 40th anniversary. He was effusive in his speeches about Soviet leadership and its technological supremacy in the world, hailing Sputnik as proof that, quote, an east wind was prevailing over the west wind. In short, capitalism was on its last legs. But it ran counter to the mood set by Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, who wanted to make much-needed reforms. Soviet technical exchanges for experts and the materials for a nuclear program proceeded as planned, but the next year they ran aground. In 1958 and 1959, Khrushchev was angered by the hubris of the Great Leap Forward and Mao's provocations at Quemoy with Taiwan and the United States Navy. Seeing Beijing as brash and reckless, the Soviets reneged on their promise to build China atomic weapons and recalled Soviet technicians in mid-1960. Mao and the Chinese Communist Party responded in those years with a war of words, challenging that the Soviets had become revisionists. They had become lame in their support for revolutions in the Third World, and that they'd actually ceded momentum in the Cold War to a paper tiger in the United States. The failure of the Great Leap Forward was a major blow to the leadership and control of the party by Mao. For a time, he became just the symbolic head in Beijing, although he still wielded enormous power within the military and the party itself. But actual policy formulation was exercised by Liu Shaoqi, and able advisors. So here's Liu Shaoqi with the white hair standing next to Mao. And then on the right of Mao is his able advisor, Deng Xiaoping. They were able to destroy the illusions created by sloganists and ideologues and actually create factual reports on the production of communes, industry, science, finance, commerce, and even the arts that would allow them to institute much more reasonable goals, targets, and methods for modernization. Under Liu Shaoqi's leadership in the early 1960s, the Chinese Communist Party abandoned radical ideas about class struggle or campaigns, instead for gradualist solutions that were set by technical experts and economic planners at the top of the party. Their success, though, had a political fallout. Mao was beginning to fear that China, like the Soviets, was headed down a revisionist path. It was going to be defined by bureaucratic corruption, entrenched interests, and a loss of revolutionary spirit intended for social modifications. To save the country, he began planning a new mass campaign, but this time one led by himself and youthful ideologues outside the party who would be motivated by the same cause and celebration of a radical new China to be built as he was. While Mao deserves the lion's share of the blame for the Great Leap Forward and the enormous loss of life, the duration and intensity of this movement also suggests the range of complicit actors across society. One reason one might surmise for why this was pursued with such vigor was that by the early 1960s, Chinese society was actually a nation of young people. Torn from the tradition and the past, they were eager to make their own mark as the elder revolutionary generation had on history. The old crises that had marked the careers of Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and Peng Dehuai, the Long March, the war against Japan, civil war, land reform, those things had all been completed. Youth, and especially the emerging new elite from peasants and workers, were eager to make their mark in the next stage of China's liberation and march toward modernization. We can also see that the Great Leap Forward is in some ways an ancient practice that was mutated by the powers of a modern country. Enormous public works like the construction of the Grand Canal, the erection of prehistoric capitals in Zhengzhou using walls of earth, the rebuilding of the Great Wall during the Ming were all similar in goals and the massive application of human muscle through organization to the Great Leap Forward. More recent was the creation of the airfields in Chengdu for the US B-29 bombers during the Second World War by the Nationalists. In that sense, Mao's use of rural power in conscripting labor was somewhat natural and fits within the traditional prerogatives of an emperor. And in some ways, we can also see his move to decentralize the state and purge society of elites and officials that he found disloyal, such as Peng Dehuai, as in some ways much like Zhu Yuanzhang at the start of his reign and the founding of the Ming Dynasty. But ultimately, the scale, the scope, the intensity of what happened to Chinese society during the Great Leap Forward is unlike anything before or since it in Chinese history. Some of the more interesting works done by scholars going into communities that were particularly affected by famine and malnutrition has discovered that in the decades since, a lot of folklore and stories about ghosts, unhappy, angry spirits within villages and across communities in China is actually a cover for the retelling of crimes done by people at the harm of the state during this period. In a way, talking about ghosts is a way to safely talk about the dead and people that were done wrong and victimized by the Great Leap Forward, its ambition, its poor planning, and the callous way in which it tossed lives at the goal of producing industrialization. Okay, so hopefully you're all doing well this week. Don't forget your test is due sometime in the coming weeks, although if you've been in contact with me, know that I'm not really putting forward any kind of late penalties for work as long as you turn it in before the end of the semester. Get in touch with me if you have questions, do your best to complete the modules, and of course, above all that, take care of yourself in terms of your health. Be well.